The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
This is Russ Ward in the NBC newsroom in New York, bringing you events surrounding the tragic death of the late John F. Kennedy. The former president's body in repose throughout the day today at the White House, close friends and high government officials paying their respects. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, conferring this morning and throughout the day with high cabinet officials, with others in the government, with former President Eisenhower. In Dallas, Texas, a 24-year-old man, Lee Harvey Oswald, being held without bail, charged with murder in the assassination of the late president. An awesome aspect of this tragedy is the historical fact that since 1840, each president nominated at 20-year intervals has died in office. In 1840, President Harrison, dead in office. Nominated in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated 5 years after that nomination. In 1880, President Garfield, gunned down by Charles Guiteau in the Capitol Railroad Station as he was about to start out on a vacation. Nominated in 1900, President McKinley, shot by an anarchist at Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. In 1920, Harding, dead in office. Nominated in 1940, President Roosevelt, died 5 years later in office. And nominated in 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, whose life taken by an assassin's bullet in Dallas, Texas. Since 1840, each president nominated at 20-year intervals, dead in office. Further report now from the Capitol as we go to Edwin Newman in Washington.
We've just been told that Mrs. Johnson and President Johnson are to visit Mrs. Kennedy at this moment. They should, at this moment, have left the Executive Office building and crossed to the White House to see Mrs. Kennedy. One of the things that strikes us here in Washington is that however magnificent Mrs. Kennedy was yesterday, and she was, what she has done to this point will have been easy compared with what she must go through in the public events of tomorrow and Monday. The strain on Mrs. Kennedy is going to be beyond anybody's power to conceive, and we must all hope that she will be able to call on the same strength that sustained her yesterday. Yesterday, perhaps, she was helped by the stunning swiftness of events that left her perhaps in shock. As time goes by, what has happened must weigh on her more and bear in on her more. And the public appearances that she will have to make as the widow of the late president will surely be the most difficult thing that she has ever done.
It's been an important development at Dallas Police Headquarters. For that story, to Tom Pettit in Dallas.
The chief of the Dallas Police Force, J.E. Curry, has just reported to us that the paraffin test taken on the suspect, the man charged with the crime, Lee Oswald, the results of the paraffin test are positive. Now, the chief points out that what this means is that this proves that the man had fired a gun. He says it does not definitely link him to the rifle, which is suspected of being the murder weapon used in the assassination of President Kennedy. The investigation goes on. There are only partial fingerprints on the rifle, the chief says, and these cannot definitely be linked to Oswald. This crowd here is waiting to see Oswald in the event he is brought in for further interrogation. That's the situation up to this moment at Dallas Police Headquarters. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News in Dallas.
Now, for further details from Washington, let's switch to Robert Abernathy at the Capitol in Washington.
When President Kennedy's body is brought here to the Capitol tomorrow, it will be carried up the main east front steps and placed in the rotunda on a black velvet-draped bier. The bier is normally kept in the sub-basement of the Capitol. It was built originally to support the body of Abraham Lincoln, which also lay in state in the rotunda. The rotunda will be open to the public all tomorrow afternoon and until 9 tomorrow night, again from 9 to 10 Monday morning. The body of every American president who has been assassinated has lain in state here in the rotunda on the Lincoln Bier, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and now Kennedy. So have the bodies of Presidents Harding and Taft. The last president to lie here was Mr. Taft. The last time the Lincoln Bier and the rotunda were used was in 1958, when the unknown soldiers from World War II and Korea were honored. Throughout the Capitol this morning, quiet meetings have been in progress, officials trying to make the arrangements for the thousands of people expected to come here and pass by the casket, perhaps kneeling for a moment on the low rail beside it. Senators have just announced their plans to meet here at 2 this afternoon to go with their wives in procession to the White House to pass by the casket there. In the rotunda now, platforms are being built for cameras, and a seamstress kneels by the bier, repairing those corners of its solemn covering, which have become slightly frayed. Robert Abernethy, NBC News at the Capitol.
Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry has told newsmen the FBI interviewed Leo Oswald a week ago or two ago. He was asked if the FBI noticed Dallas police of Oswald's presence, and the chief replied, "No, sir, they did not." And then he added, "Why they hadn't gotten around to informing us of this man, we don't know." He said the FBI told him of the interview last night after Oswald was in custody. Chief Curry said the FBI agents did not reveal what information they'd learned from their interview, or if the interview indicated he was a person to watch. And Curry said, "I think his actual target was the president. I say this because he hit the president twice from about a 70-yard distance on a slant, and apparently he was an expert marksman." Curry said communist literature was found in Oswald's apartment. He said he believed the material was for Oswald's own reading purposes and not for distribution to others. And, of course, Chief Curry's point about Oswald being an expert marksman was confirmed by former Sergeant Goodwin out in Los Angeles, who said that Oswald indeed made high scores on the rifle range at Camp Pendleton. And for more than 2 weeks, the Secret Service agents worked very quietly in the city of Dallas to prevent the very thing that happened, the assassination of the president. They inspected the site for President Kennedy's speech. They surveyed the route of his motorcade. They questioned individuals whom they knew the president would come into contact with. They kept a log on known troublemakers in the Dallas area, checking their whereabouts and their habits. At first, the Secret Service vetoed the site of President Kennedy's speech, the Dallas Trade Mart, on the ground that it had too many balconies which could hide a sniper. They finally relented, but only after making sure that all 14 entrances were covered and all persons coming and going could be watched. They supervised the selection of the menu, then they supervised the preparation of the food, and made sure that the president received no different food from all the other guests. They made sure that all points along the route of the president's motorcade were amply staffed. Congested intersections and places where crowds would gather had an extra complement of police. They even enlisted 350 policemen from the Dallas Police Force and the Dallas County Sheriff's Office to help on the day. And in spite of all that precaution, it was to no avail. And staff physicians at Parkland Hospital in Dallas and the University of Texas Southwest Medical School, who attended the fatally wounded president, all agreed today that the late president never knew what hit him. He was dead for all practical purposes when he arrived in the emergency room, said Dr. Malcolm Perry, one of the surgeons and specialists who were with the late president in the fading moments of his life. Mr. Kennedy was rolled into Parkland Hospital emergency room within 5 minutes after the sniper's bullet pierced the midsection of the front part of his neck and emerged from the top of his skull. The severity of the wound made it instantly noticeable that it was mortal, Dr. Perry said. He never had a chance. I guess we worked on him about 20 minutes. I couldn't tell how long. We were working so frantically, and after a while, Dr. M.T. Jenkins turned to me and said, "It's too late, Mac." That's the report from Dr. Malcolm Perry, one of the surgeons and specialists who were with the late president in the fading moments of his life at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. We have word from Moscow that Soviet television, in its first Telstar communications satellite broadcast, showed President Kennedy's coffin returning to Washington today. And it's interesting that in the early hours this morning, that report. That television report was fed from NBC headquarters here in New York, carried by Telstar overseas, and then shown in Moscow this morning. You know, you were talking about the death of Aldous Huxley, and while the nation is mourning the death of President Kennedy, we have another very tragic story, a story that would command national headlines at any other time but this. This is a story from Norwalk, Ohio, where 65 elderly men and women perished in a rural rest home fire today, in the worst fire in this country since 95 persons, 92 children and 3 nuns, died in the Our Lady of Angels school fire in 1958 in Chicago. Norwalk State Fire Marshal Fred Rice said there were 86 residents and 3 employees in the Golden Age nursing home 10 miles from Norwalk, and in his words, 65 didn't get out. Rice, after an on-the-spot inspection with Governor James Rhodes, confirmed that 3 employees and only 21 of the elderly residents, many of them invalids, escaped from the one-story building, which quickly became an inferno as winds whipped through the structure. This tragedy, though, in Norwalk is far from the worst in the history of Ohio. 3 fires there have each claimed more than 100 lives. The worst of them all was the one back on April 21st in 1930, when a fire in the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus killed 320 prisoners. But Governor Rhodes, as he viewed the ruins of the Golden Age nursing home in Norwalk, said, "This is the most distressing thing I have ever seen." He ordered all assistance that the state's command made available. Then, after that, Governor Rhodes flew to Washington to join other officials in paying their respects to the slain president this afternoon. And Governor Rhodes of Ohio, along with governors of many other states, will go to the East Room of the White House very shortly now this afternoon, when governors of the states and senators and representatives will go to the White House to view the president. And now we have, I think, further word on the developments in Dallas, and for a report on that, we switch to Tom Pettit in Dallas.
Here at Dallas Police Headquarters, Lee Oswald still is in jail, still apparently maintaining his innocence in the killing of President Kennedy. The job now is the questioning of witnesses and the pursuing of other information. A man named Joe Rodriguez Molina is being questioned. He was a fellow employee of Oswald. Apparently, so far, there is nothing to link him to Oswald, other than the fact that he is listed on the Dallas Police list of subversives. Oswald, we are told, has refused to take a lie detector test, saying he didn't think he needed to take it. Chief Curry of the Dallas Police Department has made an appearance here to deny earlier stories that the FBI had some information on Oswald earlier and had him under surveillance. The chief now says he doesn't know whether that's true or not, but he wants to deny that he's accusing the FBI of not cooperating. He says the FBI, the Secret Service, the Texas Rangers, and the Dallas Police Force all are cooperating in the job now of digging up evidence and new information. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, reporting from Dallas Police Headquarters.
Well, Robert McCormick in Washington, I know you heard that report, too, from Tom Pettit down in Dallas. Let's switch back to Robert McCormick in Washington.
I was a little puzzled by the report when it first came in, because generally the cooperation between the FBI and the Secret Service and the local police on matters of that sort is most thorough and complete. Obviously, there's too much at stake to be petty about such a thing. If there had been a lack of communications, I'm sure it would have been physical rather than spiritual, so to speak. It would have been an accident, but it would have been a most unlikely accident, even so. When an area is to be canvassed before a president comes into it, all units involved work very, very closely together, and they exchange information readily. As a matter of fact, sometimes they exchange information that to most of us would seem trivial, highly inconsequential. So it would have been most remarkable if the FBI, or for that matter anyone else, had even the faintest suspicion that someone should be watched, and had failed to pass that information on.
I've just been informed that we have important new developments now in Dallas, and for that story, let's switch to Tom Pettit in Dallas.
Dallas Police Headquarters is District Attorney Henry Wade, whose job it will be to prosecute Lee Oswald, the man accused of killing President Kennedy. He also is a longtime and close friend of Texas Governor John Connally, who was wounded, of course, in the bullet attack on Friday. Mr. District Attorney, do you feel that you now have enough evidence to successfully prosecute Oswald?
I think we have sufficient evidence at present to prove that he was the one that killed the president.
What is the most telling of that evidence?
Well, I don't want to go into all of the evidence here because we have to pick a jury that's going to try him, and I am refraining from going into any of the evidence that we have.
Suffice it to say that you now feel you have adequate evidence?
Yes, I feel we have sufficient evidence at present. Of course, we want more. The more we have, the better off we are. But if we had to go on just what we got, we have sufficient.
What legal steps now lie ahead before Oswald can be brought to trial?
Under Texas law, the defendant's charged in the justice court. Then the next proceedings is the grand jury. Everyone's tried in Texas on an indictment, which only a grand jury can return. Defendant's entitled to an examining trial or a hearing, a writ of habeas corpus hearing on whether or not he can justly be held without bail. Texas law allows people the only people that can be denied bail under the Texas law is a person who will likely get the death penalty. And he can have a hearing, either examining trial or a hearing before a district judge on a writ of habeas corpus, see whether remanding him without bail was proper in this case.
And this, of course, is virtually unique in Texas as compared to other states, is it not? The procedures involved?
Well, I'm more familiar with the ones here than in other states. This is a state district court.
What is the earliest you think he could be brought to trial?
Well, it'll be presented to the grand jury either Wednesday of next week or Monday, December the 2nd, one of those 2 days. It'll be set for trial within about 2 weeks thereafter. The defendant is entitled usually to 1 or 2 continuances if he asks for them. I figure that he will likely be tried around the middle of January.
Do you think you can find an unbiased jury in Dallas, Texas?
We hope we can find a jury that'll be fair to the defendant and fair to us.
And will you ask death in the electric chair for Lee Oswald?
Yes, sir.
That was District Attorney Henry Wade, District Attorney of Dallas County. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, reporting from Dallas Police Headquarters.
Thank you very much, Tom Pettit. While we've been reporting here, my colleague Russ Ward has been checking on new developments around the world, checking on the summary of events up to this time. Here is Russ Ward.
Thank you, Jim. Much of my checking has been in a coffee shop across the street getting a bite of lunch. I might add that at all the tables, people were talking about this tragedy. Groups of people discussing where they were, what they were doing when they first heard of the news. I might also mention that I tried to buy a newspaper at the coffee shop and was told they were sold out, that they had been for some time, at which point a waitress came over and said, "I happen to have a copy of a paper if you'd like to see it, but you have to promise to give it back to me." So she allowed me to read her newspaper, apologizing that it wasn't a New York Times, but let me read it anyhow, which I did, and returned the paper to her. I assume she passed it on to another customer who was unable to find the paper anywhere. Just an indication of the thirst for news that people have, both the written media and what they are receiving currently on our continuous coverage on radio and television.
And now, apparently, news from the air to Ed Goff at National Airport.
Former President Truman has just arrived here aboard a T-39 Sabreliner jet from the Air Force. He was helped down the steps. He looked, for the first time that I've seen him, he looked like an old man as he came down the stairs. Then he came up to the microphones and had this to say.
Mr. President, can you give us a statement today?
I made 2 statements already today, which you have already had on the radio and the television and everywhere else. But if you want another one, I'll give it to you. Of course, I was shocked.
Wait just a second. Put the carpet out of the way. Well, move a little further.
He's on my side.
Thank you, General.
All right, he's going.
Now, what is it you want to know?
Would just give us a statement on your reaction and your arrival and your plans.
Oh, well, I was very much shocked and hurt when I heard of the passing of the President of the United States. He was a good man, an able president, and he did a good job. And it's too bad that those things have to happen, particularly by some good-for-nothing fellow who didn't have anything else to do but to try to take the head of the state away from us. But we have to make those things. It's been done time and again before. It was attempted one time when I remembered very well, but it didn't succeed.
I mentioned
Will you
this
have any
reminds
advice
you
for
of a
Mr.
time
Johnson?
20 years ago. How can you advise Mr. Johnson as compared to yours?
Mr. Johnson needs any advice, he'll ask me for it. He's the President of the United States. The man doesn't volunteer information to the President unless he asks for it. Too many of you did that to me, and I didn't pay any attention to you.
Have you been asked to call on the President now?
I have not.
Have you talked to President Johnson since
Yes,
taking
I
office?
have. I've talked to him.
Could you tell us something about the
No,
conversation?
I will not, because that's confidential. You ask the President if you want to find out.
What are your plans right now, sir?
Go to the hotel and sit down if I can. If you guys will let me do it.
We're going right to the White House.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we let him go away. I say he looked old, but as you heard, he still has the fire that he's always had. He called the assassin a good-for-nothing who took away our head of state. As you heard a little interruption on the tape at the beginning there, that was when the car taking the president, our former president, to the White House or to his hotel, was driven up right between us and the cameraman. You heard the cameraman complaining. That was what that dispute was about. Mr. Truman seemed to enjoy it quite a bit. It was as if he were his old self. At the same time that we were talking to him, we found out later former governor, or rather New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller also arrived at another section of the airport. We tried to rush over and get him and got there in time to see his car moving away. He is also now in Washington. This is Ed Goff, NBC News at Washington National Airport.
Former President Truman's attitude toward the question of whether he had any advice for the new President Johnson is so characteristic of his respect for the office of President. He said, you don't just volunteer information to the President of the United States. If he wants it, he'll ask for it. He is President. He admitted he had talked to President Johnson, but refused to say what. Once again, this is a mark of respect for the office, because by tradition, no conversation with the President is ever released except by the President himself. Sometimes, of course, this is honored in the breach, but that generally is the tradition. And President Truman has always abided by it since he got out of the White House. I think we're, at the moment, cleared up down here. Russ Ward, have you anything there?
Robert, we might mention that Queen Frederica of Greece will attend the funeral services for the President on Monday. New York Stock Exchange will be closed on that day, as will the Midwest Stock Exchange. Of course, all government offices are closed on Monday, now officially proclaimed as a day of mourning by President Johnson. Metropolitan life insurance offices all across the nation will be closed on Monday. Mr. Truman's characterization of Oswald as a good-for-nothing fellow who didn't have anything to do comes at a time when we are piecing together bits of information about this man. He's described as a loner who kept pretty much to himself all his life, one who held radical views but was not regarded as a troublemaker, at least during his early years. That's the portrait of 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald as we pick up pieces of this young man's life from Dallas and elsewhere. Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry said Oswald has readily admitted he is a communist, apparently proud of being a communist. He didn't try to hide it, said Curry. Although formally charged with the murder of Mr. Kennedy, Oswald has withstood all efforts by authorities to gain any admission from him of any kind. He has told the newsmen, "I did not kill the president. I did not kill anyone." Oswald has refused to take a lie detector test. He's 24 years old, stands 5 feet 9, weighs 160 pounds, and described as with regular features, straight black hair, cool and defiant as he is held for further questioning in Dallas, often arrogant, with an easy smile, as authorities there say. He was born in New Orleans, October 18th, 1939, and said later his father had died before he was born. Police in Dallas have brought in for questioning a second man, Rodriguez Molina, who worked in the same Texas school book depository building used by the sniper yesterday, the same building in which Oswald worked. Police have stressed that Molina came voluntarily. He was not booked, and police have doubted that he was connected with Oswald. They also cleared an unidentified man who drove Oswald to work yesterday. He did volunteer and took a lie detector test. As the nation grieves the tragic events of the last 24 hours, this Saturday afternoon, customarily set aside for a time of scholastic hoopla and football games, many of them now postponed, most of them, in fact, canceled because of the death of the president. The clash for the Big Ten title at East Lansing, Michigan, between Illinois and Michigan State has been postponed to Thanksgiving Day. The decision leaves the Oklahoma-Nebraska clash as the biggest on this Saturday's schedule, the game to be to determine the Big 8 representative in the Orange Bowl. There was a trend toward rescheduling to a later date among most colleges. Among the games rescheduled for Thanksgiving are Columbia-Rutgers, the Wisconsin-Minnesota, and the Virginia-Maryland game. Games that were postponed until Saturday, November 30th include the California-Stanford football game, Princeton-Dartmouth, North Carolina-Duke, Oregon State-Oregon, Washington State-Washington, and the UCLA-Southern California game. Pitt-Penn State, Southern Methodist-Baylor, and the Rice-Texas Christian game will be played on December the 7th. The American Football League has postponed all 4 of its games scheduled for tomorrow. National League games will be played, but Commissioner Pete Rozelle has suggested the omission of the usual halftime ceremonies, the entertainment and the team introductions that normally accompany these football games. All 3 Boston professional sports teams have canceled their weekend home engagements out of respect for the president. The Celtics game scheduled for tonight against the Philadelphia team, and tomorrow's Boston Patriots, Kansas City, and the Boston Bruins, Detroit Red Wings contests also have been postponed. Many stores throughout the nation closed today, will be closed Monday, out of respect for the late president. In Pittsburgh, the 3 major stores plan to remain closed until 2 p.m. Members of the Houston, Texas Retail Merchants Association plan to close all stores until noon. All downtown stores in Columbus, Ohio will be closed until 1 p.m. on Monday. All major Chicago stores plan to close Monday, the day having been declared a national day of mourning by President Lyndon Johnson. Most of the large department stores in New York City also expected to close. The National General Corporation said theaters in 16 western and midwestern states would be closed on Monday until 6 p.m. The chain operates 220 movie houses. Here in New York last night, all theaters closed. The only businesses open were restaurants, and they doing a very slight business as persons who had learned the news had hurried to their homes. This is Russ Ward in the NBC Newsroom in New York, bringing you continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We now go back to Washington for any further developments to be reported by Robert McCormick.
Well, first of all, a reminder that former President Truman has arrived in Washington, and New York's Governor Rockefeller also is here. The dignitaries are coming in at the airport here on what seems an endless procession, all making their way to the White House, of course, to pay their respects to the late President Kennedy. And for more on what is going on at the White House, here again is Robert Goralski.
Former President Truman arrived at the White House just a few minutes ago. He was accompanied by his military aide, General Harry Vaughn. When he arrived at the North Portico, he was greeted by Sergeant Shriver, President Kennedy's brother-in-law, and Angier Biddleduke, Chief of Protocol for the Department of State. There is indeed a procession here, probably about 25 cars now lined up in the driveway leading to the North Portico. Governor Romney of Michigan arrived a few minutes ago, as did Governor Pat Brown of California. Governor Brown was unsmiling. He said he's still in a state of shock. He found out the news yesterday in Sacramento. He arrived here in Washington about 45 minutes ago. Reverend Braskamp, the chaplain of the House of Representatives, entered the White House to proceed to the East Room. John McClellan, Senator McClellan of Arkansas, William Proxmire of Wisconsin, Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, Senator John Sparkman of Alabama, once a vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, arrived a short time ago. Senator Gore, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., representative from California, who once lived in this executive mansion, arrived, and Senator Hayden of Arizona. The cars are still moving at a brisk pace. This is the period of the day during this period of mourning when members of the House of Representatives, members of the Senate, the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, and others are now moving very, very gradually and moving out of position. Congressman Roosevelt has kindly agreed to step over to our NBC microphones. Mr. Roosevelt, what is your feeling going back to the White House at a time like this?
Well, of course, it's a tragic and sad occasion, and I think both Mrs. Roosevelt and I feel so much sympathy that we really can't find the words to express it. And we only hope that Mrs. Kennedy and the children will be supported by the prayers of all of the American people.
Did you see Mrs. Kennedy at all, sir, while you were in the White House?
No, we did not.
I imagine you can well appreciate this feeling which the First Family is suffering during this period.
Yes, I think that anyone who has lived through something very much like this knows the tremendous strain and the difficulty of adjusting to a situation which just comes on you overnight.
Well, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Congressman James Roosevelt of California, whose father, while he was president, died in office in 1945. Congressman Roosevelt has just been into the East Room of the White House where President Kennedy lies in repose. Well, that's the story here. President Truman is inside. Other congressmen are arriving. The lying in repose will continue until about 6:30 this evening. Robert Goralski, NBC News at the White House.
We continue to receive reaction from overseas to the death of the president. The latest from John Chancellor, NBC News in Berlin.
It now appears almost certain that the big square in front of the West Berlin City Hall will be renamed John F. Kennedy Square. The big open area is now known as Rudolf Wilde-Platz, but in a few days it is expected to be called John F. Kennedy Platz. Mr. Kennedy spent one of the most thrilling hours of his life in this square last June, when he visited Berlin and spoke to the largest crowd of West Berliners ever assembled. To those of us who were here in Berlin that day, it was a triumphant appearance for the president. Some of us who were there on that day returned to the City Hall Square tonight, along with more than 40,000 West Berliners for a memorial tribute to the late president. It was the second night in a row that the people of West Berlin had so assembled in silent commemoration. Tonight, groups of students carried signs reading, "We have lost a friend." One solemn youth wore a coverlet of flowers, in the middle of which was a picture of Mr. Kennedy and the single word, "Why?" Flares could be seen flickering and candles burning in the windows of buildings around the square. The mayor of West Berlin had suggested to the citizens that they burn candles tonight in memory of the president. And all across West Berlin, the candles are now burning. Last night, some candles were put in windows across the Berlin Wall in East Germany. Mayor Willy Brandt spoke briefly to the crowd in the City Hall Square tonight, speaking from the City Hall steps under a giant photograph taken of Mr. Kennedy on the day he spent in Berlin. The photograph was framed in green and red flowers, and other flowers were strewn across the steps of the City Hall. The giant bell of the City Hall, called the Freedom Bell, a gift to Berlin from the people of the United States, rang deeply for about a minute when the mayor stopped speaking. And after the tolling of the big bell, the meeting ended, but the 40,000 people stood in their places for a moment or two of absolute, dead, total silence. It was an uncanny moment as all those people stood there in complete silence, thinking of John Kennedy and what he and the United States meant to them. Then, across the city in East Berlin, the low, faraway whistle of a railroad train sounded, and the meeting began to break up. The people who had been there had done all they could have done, and they went home realizing that it could never have been enough. John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
As this story of respect and tribute unfolds in Washington, there are continuing developments in Dallas, where the assassination took place. And for the latest there, we go to Tom Perryman, station WFAA in Dallas.
We have information now from the Dallas Police Headquarters. One of our men reports a taxi cab driver is now being questioned. The cab driver is alleged to have picked up Oswald, the accused slayer of President Kennedy, somewhere between the area where President Kennedy was shot and Oak Cliff, his home. The suspect, Oswald, is alleged to have taken a bus about halfway to his home in Oak Cliff, just across the river from the downtown Dallas area, where he took a cab from there to his home. He changed clothes there and went to the theater a short time later. Also from Dallas, the county judge, Lou Sterrett, is going to meet with the mayor, Earl Cabell, as soon as he can, possibly today or tomorrow. He is proposing the erection of a monument at the spot or near the spot where John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in downtown Dallas. This is Tom Perryman at WFAA reporting for NBC News.
We also repeat a story received from the Defense Department earlier that Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, the man being held, once wrote to Texas Governor John Connally from Russia, pleading that his undesirable discharge be reversed. The exact date of that letter not known, but presumably it was while Connally was serving as President Kennedy's first Secretary of the Navy. All of which raises a new question whether the real target of the assault was Mr. Kennedy or Governor Connally. The two were riding with their wives in the presidential car when 3 shots rang out from that high-powered rifle from a high-level window overlooking the parade route. Mr. Connally was seriously injured, but is in satisfactory condition now. The president, of course, killed in that assault. Now, a statement from former Vice President Richard Nixon.
President Kennedy yesterday wrote the final and greatest chapter in his profiles of courage. Today, millions of people throughout the world are trying to find words adequate to express their grief and their sympathy to his family. I think the greatest tribute that could be paid to his memory is for each of us in our everyday lives to do everything we can to reduce the hatred that has driven men to such terrible deeds.
Mr. Kennedy's funeral set for noon Monday at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. At those solemn ceremonies, France to be represented by President Charles de Gaulle, Britain by Prince Philip and Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas-Home, West Germany by Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, heads of government and heads of state from many other countries coming to Washington to pay tribute to the late president. At 1 o'clock tomorrow, to the muffled cadence of a corps of drummers, the body in its heavy mahogany casket will be borne from the White House to the Capitol on a caisson drawn by 7 horses. There it will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda until 11 o'clock Monday. It will then be moved to St. Matthew's, a few miles away, for the Pontifical Requiem Mass that will be celebrated by Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston. Exact burial plans have not been made public by the White House. Burial is expected to be at the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. At Hyannisport today, Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the president's mother, had the unhappy task of informing her husband, Joseph P. Kennedy, that their son had been killed by an assassin's bullet. there is no word from Hyannisport as to the reaction of the elder Mr. Kennedy. In Washington, persons paying their respects to the fallen president on a rainy day, the East Room of the White House, the scene of blackest mourning. And this just in from Dallas, Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz said today, the assassination case against Lee Harvey Oswald is cinched. He said flatly, this is the man that killed President Kennedy. 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald being held in Dallas, Texas for the assassination of the president. Now we try again for NBC's Robert McCormick in Washington.
Russ, Robert McCormick is taking a brief time off. This is Edwin Newman. What were you hoping to hear from us? Reaction perhaps to the news that the police officer in Dallas has said that the case against Oswald is cinched. That is a rather extraordinary thing to say at a time like this, and they must have certainly what evidence they consider conclusive against Oswald. I wonder what they have learned that they did not tell us about earlier. Have you heard anything on that?
Edwin, we're waiting for a pickup now from Dallas on this later development. It does seem a little odd that the case is cinched this early.
They have perhaps made other tests. They had given us earlier, you remember, the results of the paraffin tests on the hands. They had not given us the result of the paraffin tests on the face. The tests on the hands had shown, they said, that Oswald had fired a rifle. The tests on the face presumably would have shown something more. I just want to say that we've had a further statement from the homicide chief in Dallas, Captain Will Fritz, the man who said the assassination case against Oswald was cinched, and who said this man killed President Kennedy. He also said, without going into the evidence, I can tell you this case is cinched. This man killed President Kennedy. We are convinced without any doubt he did the killing. There were no accomplices. So the homicide chief of the Dallas police has said that he is convinced that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy and that he did it without help from anyone else. Now, Russ, earlier today they had revealed that they had arrested a second man and were questioning him. Do you judge from this, then, that they have deduced that the second man was not connected with the crime?
Ed, allow me to interrupt you. We go right now to Tom Pettit with later developments on this story. Tom Pettit in Dallas.
Here's an example of the detail work going on. Captain Will Fritz of Homicide, who's heading the investigation, said they now have found out that Oswald left the book depository store from which the fatal bullets were fired at President Kennedy, that he's headed toward home, that he first took a bus, finding it too slow, switched to a cab. Then he went to his apartment, changed clothes, and went to the movie theater, where he later was apprehended after allegedly killing a Dallas police officer. They have located the cab driver. They have located the bus driver. These are two of the many witnesses who are being interrogated in building the case. Fritz, in his first appearance a few moments ago before newsmen, said it is a cinch case. This is Captain Fritz, head of the homicide squad, who's been conducting the investigation and interrogation. Captain, can you give us a resume of what you now know concerning the assassination of the president and Mr. Oswald's role in it?
There's only one thing that I can tell you, without going into the evidence. Before first talking to the district attorney, I can tell you that this case is cinched, that this man killed the president.
Captain Fritz says it is a cinch case. District Attorney Wade was asked if he thinks it is a cinch case. He said that there is no such thing when there are 12 jurors involved, but it is, he says, a very good case against Lee Oswald. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, reporting from Dallas Police Headquarters.
So you have just heard a pickup from Dallas with NBC's Tom Pettit, in which Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz said today the assassination case against the president is cinched, that Lee Harvey Oswald is the man who killed the president. Again, we are quoting Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz. The governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, has proclaimed a 30-day period of mourning out of respect to the chief executive who was killed yesterday. Governor Richard Hughes of New Jersey today issued an executive order closing all state offices in New Jersey on Monday, also proclaiming a 30-day period of mourning. In his executive order, Governor Hughes said all citizens of the state are requested on this day of mourning and prayer to limit their business and commercial activities to the greatest extent possible. Further developments from Washington now as we go back to Edwin Newman.
Russ, I wanted to put a question to you that I hoped you might be able to put to Tom Pettit. We have had the statement of the homicide chief in Dallas, Captain Fritz, that the case is a cinch. It has been cinched, and that Oswald is the man who killed President Kennedy, and that he did it alone. There were no accomplices. Has Tom Pettit, and I know what difficulties he's laboring under, been able to get any kind of indication from the people in charge of the case as to what the motivation of Oswald was? You suggested earlier this afternoon that it was at least conceivable that it was Governor Connolly of Texas against whom Oswald was acting, if indeed he did act. Have you heard anything more about that?
We have not, Edwin. The basis for that speculation comes from Dallas, and it is based on the fact that Oswald had written a letter to Connolly at an unspecified time, possibly while Connolly was serving as President Kennedy's Secretary of the Navy, in which Oswald is said to have objected strenuously to some ill deed he felt was done to him while he was in uniform. Apparently, he held the governor of Texas responsible for this, and there has been the suggestion that perhaps Connolly was the target for the assassination bullet. Again, we must repeat that Oswald declares his innocence. He has not confessed to anything. He has declined to take a lie detector test. And while Homicide Chief Fritz has said the case is cinched, Oswald himself says he is innocent, and the man has not yet gone to trial. So we simply pass along the latest development we get from Dallas. On the question of evidence, we have expect to hear from Pettit again momentarily, in which perhaps we can get further elaboration on that. I would assume, Edwin, that any additional evidence that may be held against Oswald will be held until the case comes to trial, that they certainly would not want to try the case on radio or television.
No, quite. They must hold the evidence, and I suppose there would be people in other countries whose judicial and legal systems are different from ours who would be shocked that even this statement has been made, that the police officer in charge of the case says, in effect, that Oswald is guilty. There are other countries that would not permit that to be said, would not permit us to say it on radio or television or in the newspapers.
It does seem unusual in that but there is a possibility of a mistrial when such statements are made before the man goes before a jury.
I suppose we're getting perhaps too far ahead of the story, but I suppose Oswald's lawyer would almost automatically say it would be difficult, if not impossible, for him to get a fair trial in view of everything that has been said. Still, it is part of our legal system to see to it that he does get a fair trial, and as you have emphasized, and rightly, he is innocent until proved guilty.
We might mention in this connection, Edwin, allow me to interrupt, that
please,
with the nationwide publicity that has been given Oswald's arrest, a change of venue would seem to me, and I speak strictly from the viewpoint of a layman, a change of venue would be impossible. That the name Lee Harvey Oswald is known now from coast to coast. Is there such a thing as granting a impartial jury to this man anywhere in the country?
Well, I think we may say this, that in a case of the surpassing importance and somberness that this one will have, whoever might be tried in connection with such a crime, any jury would surely want and want to give the most sober sort of attention to the case before it. I think any jury would go into such a case with the most serious intentions and with the deepest responsibilities, and we should be able to count on that.
Edwin, allow me to interrupt this just a moment now. As we get further developments from abroad, we go to John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
From our vantage point here in West Berlin, several important themes of communist reaction emerged today in connection with the death of the president. The point of most immediate importance to the people of the United States is that the Cold War apparently is not going to turn hot overnight because John F. Kennedy is gone and Lyndon Johnson has taken his place. There are several reasons for this. One is the great length to which Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union has gone to demonstrate publicly sorrow and shock over the death of the president. He was echoed in these demonstrations by the highest range of Soviet officials, including an influential and unofficial personality, Mrs. Khrushchev. Premier Khrushchev went beyond telegraphing his condolences today. Moscow let it be known that he returned to Moscow especially from an out-of-town trip so that he could call on the American ambassador for a personal demonstration of his feelings. On top of that, the Soviets are sending First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan to President Kennedy's funeral. Mikoyan serves a double purpose. He is an old and canny Armenian negotiator who has always got along very well with Americans, and he is a man of exalted rank in the Soviet hierarchy. Moreover, the governmental leaders of the East Bloc satellites and their propaganda organizations have been relatively profuse in their messages of condolence and their reporting of the president's death. This applies to some very tough characters in the communist world, including Antonin Novotny of Czechoslovakia and Walter Ulrich of East Germany. Both have sent messages to Washington, and the leading newspaper in East Germany, Neues Deutschland, turned over a remarkably large portion of its front page today to the Kennedy story. In Moscow, the Russians have borrowed film of Mr. Kennedy from the American embassy vaults, and a special obituary program on the late president is now being prepared for Moscow television. President Johnson is described in Moscow tonight as more conservative than Mr. Kennedy, but Moscow says that the policies of the Kennedy administration will be continued. Among other important things to recall, however, about the communist position is the fact, which must be exceedingly uncomfortable to communist propagandists, the fact that the man accused of murdering Mr. Kennedy has described himself as a Marxist and, according to one report, as a communist. Furthermore, the man has lived in the Soviet Union, reportedly sought Soviet citizenship, and married a Russian girl. Now, this poses a propaganda hurdle of gigantic magnitude for the communists, who were very quick off the mark to charge that the president had been killed by a right-wing American racist. So far, the communists have not tried to get over the hurdle, and no one in the Soviet Union, for example, has been told in any specific way of these details about Lee Harvey Oswald. But the voice of America is no longer jammed in Russia, and the people of that country are bound to get the word one way or another. So the Russians have a bad problem. They are beginning to work at a solution. Both the Soviet news agency TASS and Moscow Radio Home Service have called the case against Oswald a suspicious one, and they are jibing about the so-called police story of left-wing elements being involved, end quote. Finally, in their eulogies to the president, the universal communist line is that the world has lost a man who was working toward a relaxation of international tension, and of course, so he was. But by this tactic, the communists are making it possible to say, look, we got along with President Kennedy, and we said so when he died, but we can't get along with President Johnson. The Russians can say that if they want to. We don't know if they will or not. All we can say now is that on the basis of the evidence here tonight, the Cold War will not get a lot hotter tomorrow. John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
This is Edwin Newman in the NBC newsroom in New York. Ellie Abel is here with a late report about the funeral plans, the burial plans for President Kennedy.
Up to now, there has been no decision announced on where the president is to be buried. It had been assumed he would be buried in the family plot at Brookline, Massachusetts, where he was born. However, we've just had a report that the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, his brother, was at Arlington National Cemetery this morning, escorted by Defense Secretary McNamara, looking at potential grave sites. So there is this possibility, still unconfirmed, that the president will be buried in the National Cemetery. He is, of course, an accredited and decorated hero from his service in the Navy during the war, and if buried there, would lie alongside so many of his comrades in arms of World War II.
If the president were buried in Arlington, Elliot would emphasize what so many people have said, that he did die on duty and in the course of duty.
It would indeed, and would remove the whole business from the private family context and put him in a national shrine.
I think nobody obviously would object to there being a private family service and burial, and if the president were buried in a family plot, nobody would object. But I think there is there not, a great feeling that the president belongs to the nation.
I'm sure of that, and I'm sure also the decision will be made primarily by Mrs. Kennedy and his brothers.
If he were buried in Arlington, is there now a suitable plot that exists? Would something special have to be set up?
Well, there are plots available for war veterans, and he, of course, qualified. As I said earlier, all we know for certain is that the Attorney General and the Secretary of Defense were at Arlington today and looked at a number of sites, presumably some of the choicer ones.
Ellie, I wish you would join in. I think John Chancellor is on the circuit in Berlin and has had some very interesting things to say about the way in which the communists are reacting, and particularly the Russians are reacting to the death of President Kennedy. John, you said the Soviet government was sending Anastas Mikoyan to represent it at the funeral of President Kennedy. The last time Mikoyan was here was over the Cuba affair. He had to pick up the pieces for Khrushchev after that one.
And was sent to Cuba, by the way, to try to persuade Castro.
Also went to Cuba to pick up the pieces with Castro.
Well, Edwin, I would, if you'll allow me, submit the idea that Anastas Mikoyan, although he may have come here on a difficult errand in connection with the Cuban crisis, has always got along reasonably well with Americans. I think that...
Oh, yes, I think he was sent here at the time of the Cuban crisis because he got along well with Americans. I was only remarking that, he obviously has such a record and such a reputation.
And also, he's a man of considerable rank in the Soviet Union.
I was struck by something you were saying before, John. We on this side, many people on this side, have been worried about the possibility that the Cold War would get hot because of what had happened, and your view and the view of most people is that that is unlikely. It will not get appreciably hotter. But from what you said, I have the impression that the Russians are somewhat worried also, and possibly more worried than we are. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I have no way of knowing what is in Mr. Khrushchev's mind, but it seems to me that they had been able to work out some reasonable agreements with him. They were small, but they were leading in a particular direction. And now, of course, they have quite another quantity to deal with, another human being with a different political chemistry. And I think, however, the general view here, Edwin, is that the technicians and some of the not absolutely top-level policymakers will now take over for a while. This would indeed have happened in the Soviet Union had Khrushchev died suddenly, that the apparatus or establishment takes over for a while because it's very technical and complicated to be a single leader, as Kennedy was, in a sense, and as Khrushchev. And I think Ellie would agree that the role of Dean Rusk in the course of American policy and foreign affairs has been amplified and magnified by this.
Would you agree, Ellie, that Secretary of State Rusk's role is much larger now, especially early in the Johnson administration?
Yes, I would have to agree. President Johnson has sat in over the past 3 years on a great many important policy discussions, but he has not made the kinds of decisions that a president does make. There's no way of training for that kind of job in advance. My guess is that he will lean rather heavily on Secretary of State Rusk and Defense Secretary McNamara and others who over the past 3 years have shared the President Kennedy's burden in making these decisions.
And, Edwin, if I can come in on what Ellie said, for the reason that the known quantities of McNamara and Rusk and a number of other people, that if they have a heavier role in this, they are rather well known and are not likely to go off in a dangerous course from a Soviet or a communist point of view, and therefore I don't think there is any high-level apprehension in Moscow tonight.
John Chancellor, allow me to interrupt just a moment here. This is Russ Ward in New York. I was intrigued by your statement of a moment ago that the communist bloc nations now are allowing VOA broadcasts to get in unjammed. What significance do you attribute to that?
Well, it's part of the general easing of tensions in teeny-weeny little steps, if you want to use an untechnical phrase, that we have achieved over the past year or so with the Soviet Union. And the foreign broadcasts, I believe the Russian language broadcasts are no longer jammed in the Soviet Union. And when the Voice of America broadcasts the details on the man who's accused of murdering the president, they do so much as we do in the United States. We say what we know about him, and therefore I believe that's getting through. This, of course, means that the Russians no longer live in a hermetically sealed society, that they can get these programs if they want to go to a little trouble to get them, and it means that the Russians are going to have to work out a rationale. They came out very quickly. With the minute they learned the pigmentation of that killer in Dallas, Moscow began talking about right-wing elements. And so I might point out that a lot of people in Britain and Germany and France and everywhere else, and editorial writers in newspapers, communist and non-communist, began digging out the files on what they'd done to Adlai Stevenson in Dallas, and this about Dallas and the rest about Dallas. The Soviet propaganda apparatus, working with these materials, very early on in the game, implied fully in their statements and coverage of this that the deed had been done by somebody of the extreme right who was angry with Kennedy for his position on the color problem in the United States. Now they've got to find a way of taking that back and acknowledging somehow to their own people the fact that this man once lived in the Soviet Union, requested Soviet citizenship, married a Russian girl.
John, State Department authorities said earlier today, and perhaps Ellie Abel will have more on this, said they have no evidence indicating the involvement of the Soviet Union or any other foreign power in the assassination of the president. I wonder if this news has been consumed by the Russian people. Has this been made available in the Russian broadcasts?
I don't know. I would venture to say not in the order of these things. That might be used later by Moscow radio or home service Russian radio, but at this point I don't believe, although I don't have the transcript of their broadcast, that it so far has been used. Are we holding a lot of people up, or could I ask a question?
Russ Ward, I think you're in command. Are we holding other people up?
We're holding no one up, and the microphone is yours, John.
Well, I'd like to ask all of you what reaction you had, and I haven't been able to hear the coverage, so perhaps you've gone through this, but the original reaction you had when you learned of the president's death, did you feel that suddenly that the Russians might do something, that the Russians might take advantage of the fact that he'd just been killed to do some awful and not really well-defined thing to us? Was there any feeling like that in the United States?
Russ, why don't you answer that?
I don't think so, John. I think this country has a history of bipartisan support in most foreign policy, certainly in our dealings with the Soviet Union. I think the death of the president was more a personal thing, not one that could be translated in terms of what do we do now in Berlin, or what do we do now about Formosa, or what do we do about the Soviet Union or Cuba. I think that by and large, everyone in official Washington and everyone else is dedicated to The freedom of Berlin is dedicated to the freedom of this country in its fight against international communism. I don't think for a minute that there were thoughts of sudden collapse of our foreign policy. Ellie, you probably have more to say on that than any of us.
Russ Ellie's had to go, has had to answer a call. He has a number of people on the line from whom he's getting information. I think the answer to John, my answer to John's question would be that at the time President Kennedy was killed, I do not believe that anybody thought that any foreign power had anything to do with it. At least I don't know of anybody who thought that. I didn't hear it suggested. I think a great many people had the same reaction, that the same feeling that the Russians so apparently unwisely did, that it was something that came from perhaps the extreme right, somebody crazed but on the extreme right. That was a reading that, so far at least, appears to have been false. But I think since everybody was stunned and astonished and at first unbelieving, that it didn't occur to anyone that this might be any sort of international plot, or that the Russians would try to take advantage of it, because that would be too transparent a thing and too dangerous a thing to do. Anybody who tried to take advantage of it might well be associated in the public mind with the idea that they were responsible for it.
Edwin and John, too, the immediate reaction that I heard in Washington was one that possibly it was a person who was irate over President Kennedy's civil rights program. As it turns out, if what we hear from Dallas is true, this seemed to have a negligible role in what took place, if any role at all.
I'd like to rephrase my question, if I may. I didn't mean to imply when I said it, prompting these interesting and significant answers of yours, that I had believed that the Soviet Union had any, causal relationship with the shooting. But I was interested in the attitude of the American people. We tend, under our system, more and more nuclear weapons make us do this, I believe, to think of the president as a man who has a button, and if he presses that button, all kinds of things go off, and we're in a war. And that Khrushchev has a button. And when one of the two men in the world who control these enormous arsenals of nuclear weapons dies, and there is this moment of uncertainty that follows his death about, excuse me for phrasing it this way, but who's got the button? Did any of these thoughts go through the minds of people you knew, or your own minds? And I'm not talking now vis-a-vis the Russians or any plot or any foreign policy things. You see what I'm getting at, Edwin?
I see what you're getting at, John, and I do not know of anybody to whom that idea occurred, with the exception of the Germans, apparently, who took certain precautionary measures and put their armed forces, so we understand from Wells Hangen, on a very high alert called Alert 1. That is, I suppose, a reasonable enough precaution to take when you are that close and when you don't know what is happening. But I am not aware of anybody who thought that the Russians would try to exploit this. What I was trying to say before was that I think the danger of trying to exploit it would have been overwhelming. I think anybody who tried to exploit it might have been accused of being responsible for it. In any case, I don't think anybody could try to exploit it without running the gravest sort of risks. Of course, we did have Pearl Harbor. People don't always stop to tell you what they intend to do to you. But the danger of the scope of the size of the reaction now is so much greater and so much more lethal that it is hard to see anybody doing anything of a risky nature.
Well, then what we're really saying, I think, is that the securities and the dangers of the world situation are really so gigantic now that the death of one man, no matter how much we may miss him, are not really going to change that balance.
They may not change it immediately, John. It is possible that they will change it in a variety of subtle ways later on because of shifting weights, shifting authorities within the, within the Western Alliance. That if, for example, President Johnson should be a less effective leader than President Kennedy has been, if American influence in the alliance should wane, if issues should arise between our allies and ourselves that cannot be resolved and that make tempers shorter on both sides, all of those things could certainly affect the future, and so the passing of President Kennedy could certainly affect the future. I think there was also something you mentioned before, that now the personal chemistry between Mr. Johnson and Khrushchev comes into the picture.
Well, yes,
ahead,
I think
what I was going to say was that President Kennedy and Mr. Khrushchev knew each other quite well, and apparently understood each other reasonably well. At least they have for the last year.
Well, they were in, to use again a non-technical term, they were pen pals. They had met, as I recall, only once at Vienna. Isn't that right?
Yes, at Vienna.
And in a very strained meeting, which I remember being there, and how we all recall how shocked and how sober the president was when he came away from that meeting. And actually, I think you're quite right in what you say, however, is that they had learned one another in a very interesting and in a kind of an intimate way. And the chemistry is going to have to be reworked again. Isn't that what you mean?
Yes, and we don't know what will come out of that. You were at Vienna, so was I, and as you say, the president was shaken and shocked, and must have been greatly saddened, but also made quite determined by what he learned there. But I think if we look back on that, we will believe that that was Khrushchev trying to take Mr. Kennedy's measure. We may now have to wait, if Khrushchev is so inclined, for him to take Mr. Johnson's measure. And until he does, we may not be able to know how well they're going to get along. And how well they get along will have a great deal to do with the future of all of us.
I agree absolutely, and would only add to that when I was talking about the death of one man not changing the balances of the world, I meant that, of course, quite in the present.
Yes.
There are some other stories in on our desk right now. An interesting sidebar on the situation from Mineola, New York, where 12 Americans in Mineola, Long Island, have not been told of the assassination of President Kennedy. They're members of a murder trial jury, now deciding the sentence for a young man they found guilty of a hold-up murder. Supreme Court Justice Edwin Lind shielded them from the news in fear that it might affect their deliberations. Cab drivers who took them to and from a motel were instructed not to mention the death, and waitresses who served them got similar instructions. Police made sure they talked to no one or heard no broadcasts at the motel. So what is probably the best-known story in the world at this moment is a story that is not known by these 12 Americans on a jury in Mineola, New York, weighing the fate of a man in a trial for murder. I think there's great interest across the nation in this man, Lee Harvey Oswald. I think it bears going into the whole background on his status in the case at the present time. Police have described Oswald as a man who is proud of his communist connections, a man discharged from the Marines as undesirable. He has, however, denied killing anyone. The Defense Department announced in Washington this morning that Oswald once wrote to Connally from Russia, to Governor Connally of Texas, at that time the Secretary of the Navy, wrote to, at that time, Secretary Connally from Russia, pleading that his undesirable discharge be reversed. The exact date of the letter was not known, but presumably it was while Mr. Connally was serving as Kennedy's first Secretary of the Navy. And this raised a new question, whether the real target was Mr. Kennedy or Governor Connally. The two were riding with their wives in the presidential car when 3 shots ripped from this high-powered rifle on the 6th floor of the building overlooking the motorcade as it left downtown Dallas. The Chief of Police, Jesse Curry, has said, I think his actual target was the president. I say this because he hit the president twice from about a 75-yard distance on a slant, and apparently he was an expert marksman. One shot hit Mr. Kennedy in the head, one in the neck. Another slug tore through Mr. Connally's back, smashing ribs. He is reported now in satisfactory condition at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Oswald sharply denied both shootings, says, I didn't kill the president, I didn't kill anybody. Oswald was arrested within an hour after the president died. Police dragged him screaming and struggling from a tiny movie theater in a shopping district in Dallas, where they'd gone in pursuit of a man who had gunned down a Dallas policeman only a few minutes earlier. District Attorney Henry Wade charged Oswald with murder in the deaths of both President Kennedy and policeman J.D. Tippit. Oswald returned about a year ago from a 3-year stay in Russia, where he married a Russian woman. 4 years ago, he swore allegiance to the Soviet Union and tried to renounce his United States citizenship. It was some time in this period that he wrote to Mr. Connolly. The State Department later held he was still a citizen and could return to America. Oswald says he is now a member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Curry said Oswald readily admitted he is a communist and apparently is proud of it. He said the second man questioned worked in the same place as Oswald, the Texas School Book Depository, a private firm which buys, stores, and distributes textbooks. The chief said FBI agents reported after Oswald's arrest that they had interviewed him a week or so ago, but he said he had not confirmed this. Officers said Oswald was definitely in the book warehouse when the president was shot. The assassination weapon was found, partly hidden behind books and amid scraps of fried chicken on the 6th floor. The Police Homicide Bureau said it was a 6.5-millimeter bolt-action rifle, apparently of Italian make. Curry told a reporter he believes Oswald carried the rifle to work with him yesterday morning and passed it off as window shades wrapped in heavy brown paper to the man who gave him a ride downtown. The first suspicion of this slim, black-haired man was by a policeman who saw Oswald in the building lunchroom. The officer actually pulled a gun on Oswald, but when the manager said Oswald worked there, he was allowed to go. A building porter said he took Oswald to the 6th floor in an elevator. When he got out, Oswald asked the porter to send the car back up for him. The porter then went to the ground floor to watch the presidential motorcade. After that, Chief Curry said, it is known that Oswald descended and left the building on foot. Then, within minutes, police broadcast a description of him. About 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighs about 160 pounds. He has black hair, sharp features, and a mouth that presses tightly together when he is angry and defiant. Somehow, Chief Curry doesn't know how, Oswald reached the Oak Cliff section across the Trinity River from downtown Dallas. The chief believes that Tippit, the slain police officer, spotted Oswald from his broadcast description and stopped him for questioning. Oswald fired a pistol. The officer dropped dead. A citizen, name unknown, later called for help on the policeman's prowl car radio. Then a suspicious character was reported in the Texas theater. 6 officers entered, found Oswald in a third-row seat. This is it, Oswald said, springing from his seat. He grabbed his pistol, but it failed to fire. The officers dragged Oswald out in handcuffs. Oswald declined to take a lie detector test. He said paraffin tests made to determine from powder residue whether Oswald had fired a gun were positive. This meant Oswald had fired a weapon within a short time before he was arrested. Apparently, it could have been either a rifle or a pistol or both. They wouldn't say. Oswald is now being held without bond, ordered so by Justice of the Peace David Johnston.
Jim, I was listening while you spoke of Lee Oswald, and also while you spoke of the story that Moscow Radio and the Soviet news agency TASS are now putting out. It is very interesting that the Russians are now saying, quite officially, because it is being said on Moscow Radio, that the assassination of the president was a political crime, thoroughly prepared and planned. And they are also saying that it was not done by a left-wing man, such as Oswald evidently is. A commentator on Moscow Radio named Valentin Zorin says, those who know how the security of President Kennedy is organized know that it is not possible for a fanatic to commit such an assassination. And then the Russians go on to say, it is not accidental that it took place in the southern states, which are well known as a stronghold of racist and other fascist scum. And they say further that the president's murder was inspired by forces that were opposed to Mr. Kennedy's policy of improving relations with the Soviet Union. So the Russians have gone very, very far in holding to the position they took at once when the news came out that the president had been shot, that it was probably the work of fanatics on the right. And they are holding to that position in spite of the statements that are coming out of Dallas that the case against Lee Oswald who himself had lived in Russia for several years, is cinched. I think in the circumstances that is rather a risky and strange thing for the Russians to be doing. And I wonder why they are doing it. I wonder whether Khrushchev, for example, who has sent messages to President Johnson and to Mrs. Kennedy with no such suggestion as these in them, whether he knows and approves of what is being done. Do you have anything further on these Russian broadcasts, Jim?
No, actually we don't, Ed. That was the only information we had. And I wondered whether we're going to be able to get through, and I hope we can a little later on as this evening develops, and perhaps develop that phase of the story. Obviously, it means that we're going to have a further developing of this particular line of propaganda attack, and I think that your point in saying that Premier Khrushchev has sent those apparently genuinely sympathetic messages to President Johnson and to Mrs. Kennedy indicates a personal feeling on his part, and also Mrs. Khrushchev sent messages too that may be somewhat in variance from the official position that is being indicated now on Moscow radio and in the Soviet news agency TASS. However, there is much more to be developed during the evening, and we'll be back with more of it in just a moment.
Now I believe that President Johnson is almost ready to read his proclamation of mourning. Here is Robert Goralski at the White House.
Actually, there's been a delay in President Johnson reading his proclamation. It had been scheduled for this very minute, but now we're told it won't be until 4:45 Central Standard Time, 10 minutes from now, before he actually reads the proclamation. The proclamation was actually issued by the White House press office earlier this afternoon. It proclaims Monday as a day of mourning throughout the nation, and President Johnson recommended the people to assemble on that day in their respective places of worship to, as he put it, to bow down in submission to the will of Almighty God. Bryson Rasher is with me. Bryson, I believe you have something on the activities of former President Truman.
Well, it is interesting that President Johnson has an appointment with President Truman to see him at 4:45. Now, the delay in the message has been made until 4:45, which leads me to believe that it's possible that former President Harry S. Truman may accompany President Johnson for this particular moment in this historic first day, full day in the office of the presidency. I don't know. It's just possible, but the coincidence of the appointment time is interesting to me. It might also be possible as a show of unity that if Mr. Truman comes along, he might invite Mr. Eisenhower, and it would be a rather interesting thing if it works that way.
General Eisenhower has spent a great deal of time here today with President Johnson. They met in the Executive Office building for about 35 minutes in the Vice President's office, and then about 1 o'clock, General Eisenhower and President Johnson had lunch again in the Executive Office building. And now, as Bryson mentioned, Mr. Johnson was to have met with former President Truman at 4:45. He may well do that immediately after reading the proclamation, or as Bryson suggests, we may well have President Truman on hand at that moment, too. That's the story here from the White House.
Bob, do I hear behind you that the President is coming?
He is just walking across, yes. We are looking out the press room window now. He is coming across West Executive Avenue from the Executive Office building. He is entering the White House from through the west door on the street level. The fish room is prepared now. The cameras are getting set. Our microphones are in order, and we would imagine that it just will take him now a matter of a minute or even less before he comes up from West Executive Avenue, that entrance there, and then into the fish room. Hoping to see more now. He is in the White House now. Bryson Rash is standing next to me with a better view. We don't know anything more about the meeting with former President Truman as yet. We're assuming for the moment that it will be held immediately after the proclamation is read. Bryson?
I should assume so. It's impossible to identify anyone as they walk across the street. There's a great group of men coming across under umbrellas with raincoats on in this driving rain, and it's darkness settling over the city, and it's just impossible to identify anyone. Anyone could be with the President at the moment. But he's now in the White House, coming up in the elevator. He'll be in the fish room in a matter of moments.
The rain has not only made us awfully wet here, we're soaked through, but it's made identification extremely difficult, as Bryson has pointed out. At the North Portico, most of the persons there have their windows rolled up. The inside is steaming. And now we're here. The President is now entering the fish room of the White House. He is walking to the battery of microphones. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
To the people of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, has been taken from us by an act which outrages decent men everywhere. He upheld the faith of our fathers, which is freedom for all men. He broadened the frontiers of that faith, and he backed it with the energy and the courage which are the mark of the nation that he led. A man of wisdom, strength, and peace, he molded and moved the power of our nation in the service of a world of growing liberty and order. All who love freedom will mourn his death. As he did not shrink from his responsibilities, but welcomed them, so he would have us not shrink from carrying on his work beyond this hour of national tragedy. He said it himself. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. Now, therefore, I, Lyndon B. Johnson, President of the United States of America, do appoint Monday next, November 25, the day of the funeral service of President Kennedy, to be a national day of mourning throughout the United States. I earnestly recommend the people to assemble on that day in their respective places of divine worship, there to bow down in submission to the will of Almighty God, and to pay their homage of love and reverence to the memory of a great and good man. I invite the people of the world who share our grief to join us in this day of mourning and rededication. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States of America to be affixed. Done at the city of Washington, this the 23rd day of November, in the year of our Lord 1963, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 188th.
That was the President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, reading a proclamation issued earlier this afternoon, proclaiming Monday, November 25th, as a day of mourning for President Kennedy. As President Johnson read the proclamation, when he said, "We offer reverence to the memory of a great and good man," he was filled with emotion. We thought for a moment that he might break down and cry, or in some way show his emotions and manifest themselves in a more obvious way. Tears seemed to come to his eyes at that moment when he referred to a great and good man. He paused and looked straight ahead when he said it. He referred to the President as a man of wisdom, strength, and peace. That's it from the White House, Ed Newman.
We've just heard here in the NBC newsroom in Washington that President Johnson plans to address a joint session of Congress next week. That information comes from a top leader in the administration. He said it is still not certain whether Mr. Johnson will make his first congressional appearance as president on Wednesday or Friday, but it probably will be on Wednesday. He said he did not expect it to be a program speech or a partisan speech. That is to say, it will not deal with legislative matters. He thought the president would make a plea for national unity. Now back to Jim Hurlbut in New York.
And Ed Newman will have a report from Hyannisport in just a moment.
The NBC Radio Network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight.
And now for a report on the reaction of former Ambassador Joseph Kennedy to word that his son had been killed. We switch to Hyannisport and Jim Simpson.
Ambassador Joseph B. Kennedy, father of the late president, has taken the news of his son's untimely death remarkably well. That report we received just moments ago from the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. In fact, said our source, he's a real gutsy guy, meaning the ambassador. The source was not being disrespectful at all, but was certainly full of admiration. Because of the great length of time in which we did not hear anything about his reaction to the news, there was concern that possibly the 75-year-old ambassador was not reacting as well as some might have hoped. He's an invalid and has been in bad health for some time. But now this news out this evening that he has taken the news of his death, of his son's death, remarkably well. He was notified of this by Senator Edward Ted Kennedy at approximately 9:30 this morning. This was indicated at the compound itself by the matter of the flags. Heretofore, the flags had not been on the mast at all. But when the news had been given to Ambassador Kennedy, the flags were raised to full mast and then promptly dipped to half-mast, thus signifying that all knew of the late president's untimely death at the hands of an assassin. Our information tells us that all is very calm within inside the white picket fence surrounding the Kennedy compound. After church this morning, Eunice Shriver walked with her brother, Senator Ted Kennedy, along the beach. Then following lunch this afternoon, Mrs. Rose Kennedy, mother of the late president, strolled along the beach toward Squaw Island with her daughter, Eunice Shriver. Mrs. Kennedy is requiring no medical attention at all. She's very calm and taking this tragic news very, very well. Regarding the matter of when Senator Kennedy and Mrs. Rose Kennedy and Mrs. Shriver will leave for Washington, we have just learned that they will not be leaving Hyannis tonight. They will be leaving sometime tomorrow. The earliest they could get a plane out of Hyannis would be 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. More than likely, they will depart for Washington at noon tomorrow. Jim Jensen reporting from the Hyannis Airport.
Thank you, Jim. In Washington, Mrs. Kennedy and her two children, Caroline and John Jr., who now have been told of their father's death, have attended a private mass in the White House. 75 friends and relatives also were present. News Secretary Pierre Salinger says the children, Caroline and John Jr., were told last night. He did not say who told them of the tragic death of their father.
And to repeat earlier what we told you, President Kennedy will be buried at Arlington National Cemetery Monday afternoon. This is the wish of the Kennedy family. Mrs. Kennedy, to repeat, is now at the White House. She is being consoled at the moment by her sister, Lee Radziwill, who has just arrived from London. President Johnson is across the street. He was as of a few minutes ago, where he was meeting with former President Truman. This is Robert Goralski, NBC News at the White House.